Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Kariem. Welcome to the spot. Got my co-host Damian Ware.
What's up, everybody? Good afternoon, good evening.
Nice little topic we got here going on today, Dave.
We got a doozy today.
Juneteenth. What's fact? What's fiction? I think we're gonna have some fun with this one. We ain't got an hour. We got about an hour to cover everything, but
it's a lot.
It's a lot going on. We got to see if we can cover it, man. It's going to be like fast forwarding through it, but
right.
I think that we're going to be able to get quite a bit going on. June 17th, 2021. Joe Biden, your boy Joe.
Biden. Sleepy Joe.
I knew that was coming. Sleepy Joe Biden. Went on and put it through, got it on the books. Is one of only 5 date-specific holidays in the United States. You got New Year's Eve, that's January 1st. Juneteenth, June 19th. Independence Day, that's 4th of July. 4th. Veterans Day is November 11th, and then you got Christmas, December 25th. Okay. So it's rare air right there.
Okay.
Only one of 5 date-specific holidays. What you know about Juneteenth, man?
Man, I rarely investigated anything about Juneteenth leading up until them making it an official holiday.
Right.
I had heard about Juneteenth, but it didn't really pique your interest to really say exactly what Juneteenth was until they said, okay, we're going to actually go ahead and celebrate this day. So you wanted to kind of figure out what the significance of the day was. So initially I just thought it was just the independence. We were set free from slavery.
Right.
That's what you mostly heard, you know what I'm saying?
The same story. This is an interesting thing, and I think just basically with us being in the North and not really having a lot of interaction, because most of this was going on in the Confederate States. Most of the meat of the information of the whole holiday is surrounding around the Confederate States. So with us being in Ohio, don't really get a lot of that information up this way. And, I over the course of the last week, man, I just be asking people the same question I asked you.
Right.
What do you know about Juneteenth? The interesting thing is, based on the research that I did, none of these people had the right information. But what was more curious about it than anything was that the misinformation that everybody had, all 30 people had the same exact story.
Consistent.
It was consistent.
I knew you.
Which told me somebody's making a conscious effort to get that narrative out there. And why is the question. Why is the question. So from what I understood about Juneteenth, it was, a date in 1965 that you had these people down in the South. Emancipation Proclamation had kicked off in 1965, it was 1865. Emancipation Proclamation kicked off in 1863. And 2 years later, you had these people in Galveston, Texas that were still under slavery. And this was the time where your boy, General General Granger. And he's like the Lone Ranger coming in on a white horse to relay the information and let everybody know, man, come on, man, what y'all doing? Right. Y'all supposed to be free. This thing happened a couple of years ago.
So this was, he came in 1865. Emancipation was 1863, right?
1863. So here it is, June 1865, he comes in and he gives the order, which was considered at that time, they called it General Order Number 3.
Okay.
And General Order Number 3 actually announced to the slaves, to this population of slaves in Galveston, that y'all not supposed to be slaves no more, y'all actually free. And that's based on the story that I got and the story that everybody that I talked to, that was pretty much it.
Let me ask you, what was the during that time? You got 1865, you got Texas. I think Texas at the time was like the last enslaved people, basically in Texas. Is that the story where they was legally?
According to the story that everybody know, you would think that, wouldn't you?
So
the reality is that they was the last Confederate state
to be
that was to be free.
Okay.
And it was interesting because it was a timeline that was going on. There was a whole series of events that was going on that would make you think that, you know, these people actually knew that slavery, about the Emancipation Proclamation, that the order had been given. It was just a matter of the Union Army going around, taking back over territory, and then actually giving the order and executing the order. So
you say they basically knew. So why? So is this? So this is basically a myth that we have now that people they didn't know. How was information transferred? And you say that they knew. What leads you to?
Let me rephrase it. It seems like they would have had to know. And I'm gonna give you. I got a couple of notes in here which kind of lends me to believe that they would have known. For one, slaveholders moved to Texas and safely. They wanted to. Texas was the last state to be invaded. So at the time that happened, the Civil War wasn't really happening in the streets in Galveston and in parts of Texas.
Okay.
So it says that the Texans, or the people from around the other Confederate states, they would move to Texas as like a safe haven.
Safe haven.
And they would take their slaves with them. So that was one of the things that, since that information had came down in people in the other areas, this wasn't new people in Texas. This was just people who had migrated to Texas from. Now, it was an interesting thing. I remember one time I went down to Houston, down to Dallas, I think it was. I was going down there for a convention. And it was this young lady that was on the bus, on the shuttle that we was going from the airport to the hotel. And she was from Texas.
Okay.
And so we get to talking, and I made a statement. I said, man, I've never been this far south before. And she said, you know, I could kind of tell as the conversation went on, her whole demeanor, her body language had kind of changed to the point to where it was obvious enough to where she had an attitude. And I asked her, is everything okay? She said, well, it's just you referred to us as the South, and we don't consider ourselves the South. Now, I didn't know what she meant by that, so I said, well, you know, I'm from Ohio, so everything down here is South to me.
Right.
She said, no, but when you say South, it puts into mind for us slaveholding states. And Texas was not a slaveholding state. That's what she told me. But
the information
that's
say
not
otherwise.
true.
Right.
That's not true. Okay, so one, you got all of these slaves that was in, had migrated basically from other places, so they would have known.
Okay.
Because they benefited from that information when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed.
Okay.
Galveston, Texas was a seaport city with a population of about 7,000 people according to the 1860 census. Had about 7,000 people there.
Okay.
This is in Galveston.
In Galveston.
Where the order was recited. Of those 7,000, 1,200 of those people were slaves. 1,200.
So of the 7,000, 1,200 were slaves?
These are the people that was in Galveston.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing is that you have Juneteenth celebrating these people in Galveston. 1,200 people, but it was 250,000
That's what I was.
slaves that was in the state of Texas. So you start to ask yourself, okay, what's the reason that, you know, it's kind of starting to fall apart as far as we didn't know, you know what I'm saying? It's starting to fall apart. Okay. Next thing, like I said, Galveston, Texas was a seaport city.
Right.
So that was the way that you entered Texas.
Okay.
Is
Through
through
Galveston.
that port. All right. So as the Union Army entered Texas, now keep in mind, Galveston might have been the first place that they went.
Okay.
But they would have had to explore and go throughout the rest of the state in order to take over the territory. So, Yeah, they might have freed the people in Galveston. They might have gave them the order, but it had to be more people across the state. They couldn't have been the last ones. They would have actually been the first ones in Texas that would have gotten the order.
In Galveston.
In Galveston.
Okay, and then it spread.
And then it would have had to spread, because that's how the Union Army came into Texas, was through the seaport city of Galveston.
Okay. So that makes
sense.
sense.
A couple more things, two more. The Texas eastern border connected with Louisiana. So right there in the eastern part of Texas, where Galveston is, and where you come into Texas, it borders with Louisiana. The Union Army had captured New Orleans in 1862, like 3 years earlier.
Okay.
So the people, is no way that the people wouldn't have known.
Right.
Because our neighbor just got murdered over here. They just got conquered. They just got their territory taken back. And so, and all of these people are migrating, they kind of being backed into a corner. Texas is the last state. So a lot of these people that's in Texas, they ones that's running from the fight.
Right.
So all of them people would have known
that
slavery had been abolished. Because the whole point of the Civil War was to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And then finally, you had what they call the Rio Grande Expedition. You ever heard of that?
No.
This is interesting. The Rio Grande Expedition was where you had 5 black regiments that invaded Texas to disrupt the cotton trade, in which that was the main source of the Texas economy, was cotton.
Right.
So these 5 regiments went in way ahead of General Granger. And they was disrupting the whole state. They was basically giving them hell. So they wreaked havoc on southeast Texas cities of Brownsville, San Antonio, Houston, and Austin from 1863 to 1865. So those black soldiers was in Texas 2 years prior, knocking that state down. So as everybody was running from or running to Texas, these is the cats that they was running from. 5 black regiments that they sent in. So with all of that going on, to me, it's almost impossible that the people in Galveston would not have known when the whole state of Texas is running and under fire. So
yeah, because we've been always, led to believe that slavery was our legacy, and basically there was this. You can look at Juneteenth, and it's like this weak slave class of people was being set free. But from what you telling me in regards to like the armies and the stuff that was going on in those times, we had some active roles that we was playing in freedom. What was how did that look for us?
Not only did we have an active role, we was the drivers of it. We was the ones that was the drivers of that whole movement in order to be able to get, like for instance, they say that, from what I'm reading, 2,000 soldiers was sent into Galveston in order to take that territory back. Now, when the general came in, the smoke was cleared. So you go in, you take over the territory, then you call General Granger in. All right, we got it, it's locked down. Come on in and give the order. Now, of those 2,000 soldiers, 75%, 1,500 of those soldiers that went into Galveston was black soldiers. So this ain't something
1,500 of the 18.
1,500 of the 2,000.
2,000, I'm sorry.
1,500 of the 2,000. So my thing is, these aren't people that's just sitting on the side waiting for somebody to free them and just walking around just dumbfounded, eating now-and-laters like, I wonder what I'm doing today. I wonder how much cotton I'm going to pick today. And then somebody tap us on the shoulder and say, you know what, y'all supposed to be free. That's not really what happened. These people was in tune. They understood what the struggle was, and they was willing to give their life and buy their freedom by fighting and defending the Union.
So we had military impact with, you say 75% of that army was black.
Right.
What was the landscape? What impact did we play politically and in the legislative? Did we play a role in those times? Because we just believe, like I'm saying, we just believe we just always been slaves. slaves?
Okay, so first of all, let's establish the landscape of who was who. All right, because you had states and you had two sides. You got the Confederacy and you got the Union. Okay, so those are the players. So the Union included the states of Maine, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, California, Nevada, and Oregon. Abraham Lincoln was the president.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the Confederacy included the states of Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia.
Okay.
Jefferson Davis
was
their president.
Okay.
Which brings us to our little known Black history fact. Our first little known Black history fact. I'm going to give you a quote.
Okay.
And I'm going to see if you can guess who is the person that gave this quote. Quote, "My mother, you can trace her lineage, and I'm like a 8th or 9th or 10th or something cousin removed from Jefferson Davis, who was the head of the Confederacy. Think about that. I bet he'd be spinning in his grave," unquote.
Who was that, your boy Donald Trump?
Nope.
Who?
My mother, you can trace her lineage, and like I'm a 8th or 9th or 10th or something cousin removed from Jefferson Davis, who was the head of the Confederacy. Think about that. I'll bet he's spinning in his grave.
Yeah.
Barry?
Barack Obama.
Obama?
Distant cousin to Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America. He was actually a senator in Mississippi. And then when they seceded the Union and broke off, they elected him as the president of what they called the Confederate States of America.
Whoa. 8th, you said what?
8th, 9th, or 10th, he don't know which one.
Okay.
But through his mother's side of the family, he know that he's connected to Jefferson Davis. Just an interesting Black history fact.
Okay.
Little known Black history
Little
fact.
known.
So, and then you had states that were called border states. These were people who they could choose which side they want to be on, and they wasn't really taking one side or the other at the time. So that was Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Okay. So those were the border states, the Union and the Confederacy. And all of this conflict was going on based on what was going on in those places. So all of to understand how that thing played out, you got basically 3 major things that affected our enslaved ancestors. The one major thing was the Emancipation Proclamation signed on January 1st, 1863. Okay. And June 19th, this is the story that we're getting.
Right.
June 19th was the next thing. That was the day that the order was given for the last slaves to be freed in what was called then the Confederate States of America. And then most importantly, the state of Georgia ratified the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865, which abolished slavery nationwide. Okay, so it required, in order to get ratified, it required 27 of the then 36 states to make it part of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
So remember that point, because we're going to come back to it.
Okay.
Because that's a very important point. And we're going to knock that one out. So,
Okay.
man, it's a lot to get into.
Yeah, a lot of information.
A lot of
to cover,
information
man.
to get into. Is not our typical show.
No.
We want to stick to the information and relay it the way that it's supposed to. We don't really want to have a whole bunch of opinion on this, because in this point, it is what it is. The truth is sufficient.
Need the facts.
We need the facts. All right. So we're going to take a quick break. Upper Room Apparel. Before we get started, we're going to go ahead and run this little break and come back. And when we come back, we want to get into the landscape of the timeline of what all of these events, how they happened, and what was the repercussions of them, because there were some major things that happened, and I'm not sure, we just kind of look at it as the history. But some of these things, the way that they played out, it gives us a real, it kind of makes it simple to kind of break this thing down and see just exactly where we at, and basically give us a better idea to develop a concept of how do we feel about Juneteenth. Do we still celebrate it, but now we got a different perspective on it? You know, maybe that's the case. So we'll be right back.
That's good.
The perfect balance of streetwear and luxury proves we're just built different. The brand's DNA celebrates who we are, and is unapologetic in our cultural evolution. It's fueled by the aspirational motto and brand mantra, the upper room, where great minds meet. Walk with me.
Let's bring together every hood and every city, every barrel. Real is rare and it's that upper room apparel. Meaning of the minds and it ain't nothing but love. Great minds think alike, two brains better than one. You got my back, I got your front. Forever solid, it's in us we trust. Might not come overnight, before you walk, you crawl. United we stand, divided we fall. United we stand, divided we fall. United we stand, divided we fall.
All right, y'all, we back in the spot, dealing with this thing on Juneteenth, right? We left off right in the beginning of it, and right away, man, as we get into the beginning and setting the stage, I think in order to really understand how this thing played off, because most people, okay, you'll start with the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody kind of figures that that's where everything started. But we're going to back up a few months before that, when
Union Army.
well, you got the Union Army. Lincoln wanted to announce the Emancipation Proclamation in June of 1862. He wanted to announce it. His Secretary of State, in June.
Okay.
So his Secretary of State, William Seward, advised him against it because he said the optics was bad. The reason that the optics was bad at the time was because the Union Army was losing battle after battle after battle. And the thing that they was going to gain was, once they announced the Emancipation Proclamation, what it also triggered was the ability for black people to enlist into the Union Army.
Okay.
Wholesale. They didn't want to, Seward, Secretary of State, he didn't want the optics to look like we was losing the war, and he needed black people to help him win the war.
Okay.
So they was trying to wait for a victory
Okay.
so that they can put the Emancipation Proclamation out after a victory. But they kept on getting murdered. They kept on getting murdered over and over again. So
Were we already we were already, from my understanding, were we already fighting on the Confederate side, in the Confederate military?
now we had people that was in the Confederate, but they wouldn't let them hold guns. You can be cooks, you can, attend to like injured soldiers and that type of thing. Most of them was women.
Wow.
They wouldn't let them grab a gun. And most of the black people that was fighting on behalf of the Confederacy, they was fighting, their motivation for fighting was because they was being forced to fight because they slave owners, the owners were making them fight. The plantation owners, or planters is what they called them, was making them fight. So from August to September of 1862, they had 13 battles that was fought from August to September of 1862. The Union Army lost 11 of those 13 battles.
11 of the 13 battles?
11 of the 13.
He was
Union
getting handled.
taking L's,
Yeah.
one after the other after the other.
11 out of 13. He was getting handled.
They was getting handled.
And so this is so now we dealing with pre-proclamation.
Okay, the pre-proclamation was actually an actual document. It was
Okay.
actually a document called the pre-proclamation. Like I said, these 11 battles was lost between August and September of 1862. And on September 22nd of 1862, Lincoln said, forget it. Forget how the optics look. We need to start gearing up to get some help. And so President Lincoln issued the pre-proclamation in the midst of the Civil War that declared, check this out. Now this language is interesting.
Okay.
This language is word for word,
Okay.
right? So it declared that if the rebels did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union, if they did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union, all slaves in the Confederacy would be free on the first day of the following year.
Wow. So
Now-
is this the true motivation for
Well, see, because to me, that's anytime that I give you an ultimatum,
right.
there's a other side to that
Yeah.
coin. So you're saying, okay, if y'all don't drop your weapons and rejoin the Union, and then we going to free the slaves. But what happened if you do drop your weapons and rejoin the Union?
what's the consequence?
You get to keep your slaves. So now I got to look at Abraham Lincoln with a little side eye. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm like, okay, Abe,
He had an ulterior
your
motive.
motivation wasn't your motivation wasn't really to free the slaves. Just like they say, your motivation was to save the Union.
Right.
So once I see, and by another little known Black history fact, as the date that they was given to comply would be the first day of the following year, which meant midnight of December 31st. They had till then to rejoin the Union and drop their weapons. And so what was the slaves doing at midnight on the 31st of December?
What's that watch night service?
They was at church, waiting for the word to come down.
That's
as
watch
to
night
whether-
service.
That's watch night service. That's where it came from.
Wow.
That's why I always wondered, like, why don't people, like, you go to church on New Year's Eve, we
Right.
still doing it to keep that ritual
Still
up.
doing
But
it.
the sermon is never about the Civil War or slavery or emancipation. It seemed like they would talk about that because that
They
was the
do.
reason you there in commemoration.
That created the tradition.
That created the
It
tradition.
wasn't about bringing in the new year.
No, it wasn't about being safe so you don't get shot down on,
Right.
down on
Yeah,
Copley
right.
or nothing like that.
Yeah,
That
'cause
ain't,
that's
that ain't
how they, that's
yeah.
how they swing it, but
That's
that
how they
ain't,
swing it.
yeah,
No,
okay.
It was much bigger than that. And so you had a real high technical communication, Underground Railroad. It didn't just transport slaves, it transported information and whatnot.
Wow.
So it had to be effective because these slaves was at church all across the Confederate States, and they was waiting. They wasn't waiting at the church and going to be there for 5 days. That night, they was going to get the memo as to whether the Confederates came back or whether this activated the first stage of the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? So the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't have the power in itself to free the slaves, okay? Not by itself. It had to be a
Okay.
couple of things that needed to take place, okay? Emancipation Proclamation, now that was September 22nd, 1862. When they didn't come back and comply, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all slaves in the Confederate States of America in rebellion and not in Union hands were freed. Okay, now this is the interesting thing why I say to remember what we talked about earlier, because there were more slaves in the country than it was in the Confederate States. So if you can see, this says that declaring that all slaves in the Confederate States of America in rebellion and not in Union hands. So there was 5 states in the Union that owned slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't affect the slaves
In
that
the
was
Union.
in the Union states. Those, sorry about your luck.
Oh man.
Sorry about your luck.
So what was your boy Abe really doing?
He was trying to save the Union.
He was trying to save the Union.
Point blank. You know what I'm saying? If you understand it, and then there's no big deal. You know what I'm saying? It is what it is. You know what I'm saying? Like they say, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. But then, we come up watching Conjunction Junction, What's Your Function on Saturday morning on the cartoons, and they got the little Honest Abe cartoons, and we just fall in love with Abe.
And we
You know
real
what I'm saying?
big on this Emancipation Proclamation thing as being our freedom.
Huge. Okay? This is the thing. Emancipation Proclamation was limited. For one, it only applied to persons who were enslaved in the Confederacy or in the South.
Not the Union.
Okay. This is why the ratification of 13 was important.
Okay.
Because it was the 13th Amendment, once it got ratified, that's what freed the slaves in all over the country in the Union states. So even with June 13th or June 19th,
right.
Even with Juneteenth, that was the last slaves that was in the Confederate States.
Okay.
But they weren't the last slaves in the country that was free, because there were still slaves in the Union states that was under slavery. As a matter of fact, I think the last slaves in the country was let go in 1866. They were on Choctaw Indian plantation. And remember, they gave the Indian slaves in compensation and restitution for taking their land.
Okay.
So those slaves that was on the reservation, they were like the last ones in order for them to get recognition and credit in the Congress. In order for them to be recognized by the United States government, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment on there.
You're gonna have to help me out here.
Okay.
So we leaning on you right now
Okay.
as our historian.
All right.
1865, June 19th. We celebrating this Juneteenth.
Right.
But you mean to tell me that there was a whole nother section, be it the Union,
Yeah.
slavery was still in process?
Yeah, absolutely. You had, we talked about the border states. So you got Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Those states had slaves. None of the slaves in that state was freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. As a matter of fact, there were 3.9 million slaves in the country. Only 500,000 was freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. The rest of them was freed as a result of the ratification of the 13th Amendment.
1865, December 6th.
That's huge. Georgia was the state that put them over the top and gave them.
But wait a minute, man, because that's after Juneteenth.
Yeah.
So what we doing?
Well, hey, man, you know what I'm saying? That's what we're talking about. What you want me to say, Dave? What you want me to say? What you want me to say? We just put the information out here.
Okay, my bad.
And so you got to have something that represents. I tell you what, to me, it's kind of more accurate to say that Juneteenth represents that first stage of the process, because it was definitely a process that brought us to where we at. It was definitely a process that's brought us there. So it applied to the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation. It applied to slaves that was in the Union, in the Confederacy.
Okay.
All right. And then the second thing that had to happen in order to be able to activate the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the government, Lincoln, the Union, they never wanted to recognize the Confederate States of America as a legitimate government. They didn't want to do that.
Okay.
So if I address you as President Jefferson, then I'm acknowledging that you're a legitimate entity.
Okay.
So the second trigger that had to happen for the Emancipation Proclamation to become active in that state was that the Union Army had to go into that state, take the territory back over, and then they send the general in, and the general would enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. Because see, there was nobody with no Union presence there. There was nobody to enforce it.
Okay, right.
So on June 19th, 1865, that was at the time that the Union Army going state to state, taking back over the territory, and then sending in and announcing and enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation. They was the last ones on the list. They was the last ones that they got to, and that completed the first phase of
so
getting
that was
slaves in the
execution
Union
of it.
to be free. After President Abraham Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, black soldiers were officially allowed to participate in the war. This turned the war so drastically that the Confederacy entertained emancipation as well.
Is that Glory? Is that where we get the movie Glory from?
See, now you're starting to get, because they was losing so bad. Now, remember, before the Emancipation Proclamation, they was 2-11 in these battles, right? Now,
They was getting their boots smoked out there.
now the Emancipation Proclamation passes, they allow black soldiers to come in, and now they winning so bad that the South is entertaining. You know what? We're considering letting you fight for your freedom on behalf of the Confederacy. That's a big jump.
Go ahead and put the guns in their hands.
They called it Confederate Emancipation. Thing is, study long,
Study wrong.
study wrong. You know what I'm saying? So that happened in March 13th of 1865, but by April of 1865, they ended up having to surrender because they was losing too bad. In an effort to replenish the ranks, General Robert E. Lee authorized the recruitment of black slaves into the Southern Army. The trick was only slaves that were voluntarily freed by their owners could enlist. They didn't want to ever say they forced the people to let the slaves go in order to win the war. So they said, okay, if you want to voluntarily let your slaves go and let them free, and then they can enlist into and help us fight.
Okay.
But it took them so long to get to that point that a month later, they was a done deal. That's April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, and that was the done deal for the Civil War. Civil War was effectively over. But to me, you know, like I say, we talk about it, man, and it just seems like the black soldiers tilted the balance of power for the Civil War.
That's you know, based on my research, I was led to you know, I found that we did play very pivotal part in very crucial battles, and we was significant, had a significant impact on the Civil War.
Right. Major stuff. June 2nd, 1865, Texas surrenders. They moving across the country. They finally get to the last state. June 2nd, 1865, Texas surrenders to the Union Army. June 19th, Union Major General Gordon Granger arrives in Galveston, check this out, to take command of the more than 2,000 federal troops recently landed in the Department of Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. At this point, phase 2 of the Emancipation Proclamation is complete because the Union Army has possession of the territory. That was the second thing that had to happen.
In order.
So squash the whole idea that we was walking around and didn't know that we were slaves.
Right.
Never say that again.
That's a myth.
That's a myth.
Okay.
Never say that again. I think we got enough evidence to say, okay, no, y'all got that wrong. I don't know if you just wanted us to feel indebted to you. I don't know what the situation was that made you come up with that story. But the reality is, didn't go down like that. Okay, so here comes General Order number 3. Now check this out. This is interesting. We got 20 more minutes left to cover this, right?
We got
General Order number 3, June 19th, 1865. Your boy Gordon Granger comes in and he reads the general order. It says, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former slave masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired help.
okay.
Okay, so you got hired labor taking the place of slave-master relationship. Now you got employer and hired labor. Now, here's the trick.
Okay.
The freed men are advised, the former slaves, the freed men are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or anywhere else. Idleness.
Could not collect at the military post.
Couldn't collect
So
at the
they couldn't
military
be paid
post.
soldiers.
No. Well, the interesting thing, now you got, all right, that started the domino effect, okay? The domino effect was that you start having when they let go of the slaves. Then we went into Reconstruction. Reconstruction started a whole slew of things that was the aftermath of Juneteenth.
Okay.
And the whole finishing of the Civil War. The ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment gave them equal protection under the law, gave them their citizenship. Now, the interesting thing with that is 13th Amendment freed the slaves, but they said, okay, y'all free, but we're gonna treat you now like illegal aliens. You're illegally in the country. So now we're gonna treat you any old way that we want to right now. So the way that you hear them talking about Latinos right now,
Right.
that was the energy.
Okay.
14th Amendment canceled all that out. It gave people citizenship. Black people, descendants of slaves, gave them citizenship. Then the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. Okay, so as the Republican Party, and I'm going to refer to them as the Liberal Party,
Okay.
and I'm refer to the Democratic Party as the Conservative Party.
Because it flopped. Huh?
Because it flopped. See,
Okay.
today's Liberal Party is not what it used to be, and today's Republican Party is not what it used to be. Once they got to the point to where those things started happening, the first election that we got to vote, one of the first elections that we got to vote afterwards, they had 80% of former slaves, black men, in Confederate states. 80% of them was registered to vote.
80%.
80% of former slaves, these folks was on the plantation 10 years ago, they booted up ready to vote.
So we've officially digressed.
We doing a little worse now than we was before.
That's
We was motivated.
Yeah.
We was motivated, you know what I'm saying? But it was the interesting thing was
80%.
80%. And in that election, we voted in 3 senators and 32 people to the House of Representatives.
We voted in.
We voted in.
As a block, 80%.
Ulysses S. Grant won that election, and he wasn't even expected to win. It was the black vote that put him over the top. Black men voting, all right? So when that happened, you started to see, you know, folks standing on the side, like old boy on belly eating a banana.
I don't like that shit. For sure, bro. I don't like that shit.
Now you start getting people plotting to be able to slow down
The progress.
Oh yeah, slow down that progress. They're making too much progress, going too fast. So they tried to institute what they call the Black Codes in 1865.
Okay, tell me about the Black Codes.
The Black Codes, immediately following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the Black Codes effectively, matter of fact, I took some great notes on that. Interesting thing.
The Black Codes.
All right.
Okay.
The Black Codes, what they wanted to do was use the power of the government to institute forced labor in place of slave labor. So under Johnson, okay, President Johnson came in, he started Reconstruction. Because you had to ask the question, okay, what are we going to do with these slaves, these former slaves?
Right.
What are we going to do? How are they going to fit into society? How are they going to fit into the mainstream? What purpose do we have for them? So under Johnson's Reconstruction policies, nearly all of the 7 states would enact their own black codes in 1865 and the early part of 1866. Okay, while the codes granted freedoms to African Americans, including the right to buy and own property, the right to marry. See, during slavery, we couldn't do this. You couldn't legally, the state never recognized you being married to your wife during slavery.
Wow.
Because property couldn't marry property.
Property.
So while the codes granted certain freedoms for African Americans, including the right to buy and own property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court, and this was only in cases where white people weren't involved. You couldn't testify as a black person. You couldn't testify against a white person.
Right.
The primary purpose of the black codes was to restrict black people's labor and activity. Some states limited the type of property that black people could own, while virtually all former Confederate states passed strict vagrancy and labor laws, as well as so-called anti-enticement measures designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a black laborer already under contract. So you used to be able to have a year contract
Okay.
to where you had to actually have your contract to say, okay, you know how now they'll stop you and say you need to have an ID on you at all times, and if you don't have ID and then legally I can arrest you.
Okay.
Well, back then you had to have a certificate to show that you was employed at some plantation. If you wasn't employed somewhere, they can take you to jail. Part of the black codes.
That's
It
the
made
black
it where
codes, huh?
they had to go to work. Now you couldn't work for another black person. You had, these codes said that you had to go to work for white people. You had to sign a year-long labor contract with a white employer. Otherwise, they called you a vagrant, arrested you, fined you, and if you couldn't pay the fine, you would be auctioned off to a white person who could pay the fine.
So you're going back into slavery.
A black male with land who works for himself was illegal under the black codes. You could not be a black person
With land.
and own land and work for
yourself.
yourself. You must work for a white employer in order to keep yourself out of jail during the black code program. They was working for 2 years to structure it. Different places in the South had their own black codes and everybody was coming up with them. And then boom, because you got the right to vote, you stepped in.
The black codes.
The black codes. Because you got the right to vote and you had people who were representatives in the House, in the House of Representatives, they stepped in 1866. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and declared that all persons born in the United States to be citizens without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 eliminated the black codes before they could get some energy up under them and before they can get the rolling. It canceled them out.
Okay.
But interesting thing is, as a result of us participating in the process,
Voting, right?
voting representatives in who can speak on our behalf, people who can act in our best interests, this is the reason why we was avoiding a lot of these
Right.
pitfalls that we possibly could have fell into.
But we typically don't want to deal with politics.
It's interesting, man. And I think it's because we don't really see or we don't attribute the benefit that we're getting we don't attribute the benefit that we're getting to our involvement in the political process. We think that this is just the way it's always been. And so we don't really, I don't know, man. I don't know.
But that's why we need to be investigative or investigate history so that we can see the power. You talking about a time where we had 80% voting,
Of black men
participating amongst black
participating
men.
in the process.
Wow.
And the thing is, when you see them trying to institute black codes, they had the Reconstruction Act was in 1867. That was when they started Reconstruction.
Okay, 1867.
As a result of the Reconstruction, what they did was Reconstruction, 1867.
Mm-hmm.
Here, founded in 1865. Right along time with the black codes. By a group of Confederate veterans, the Ku Klux Klan rapidly grew from a secret social fraternity to a paramilitary force bent on reversing the federal government's progressive Reconstruction era activities in the South, especially policies that elevated the rights of the local African American population. So they would get out. Yeah, it was actually the far extreme wing of the Democratic Party that broke out and said, you know what, we're going to do anything that we can. If they go out to vote, we're going to attack them at the polls. We would kill them and threaten them coming up to elections.
Started
Just-
harassing the congressman.
harassing congressmen, anything that they can do in order to keep black people away from the polls. And really, to be honest, they was targeting Republicans, period. Yeah, it was a nice little edge put on us. They put a little bit more English into it with us. It might have been more enjoyable for them. But if you was a liberal, the more liberal you were, they was after you. The more influence you had, they was after you.
Ku Klux Klan born out of the Democratic Party.
Democratic Party for purposes of keeping you away from the polls. It wasn't, I hear people, man, if I ain't heard it a million times, yeah, they got jealous of because we was with white women and this, that. No, come on, man.
That ain't doing nothing.
No, that ain't it.
Yeah.
That ain't it. That's
it
not
was deeper.
It's a lot deeper than that.
Yeah.
You talking about folks making progress.
And power.
And the thing is, you doing a lot with very little.
Right.
And so they saying, man, these dudes, you give them an inch, they building a mile with it.
Right.
So imagine if we actually, the more they get, the more they go and build with.
Right.
So then they come up with Jim Crow.
Jim Crow laws.
Interesting, I thought about Jim Crow. I've talked to people that was in the military, right? And They said that they met people when they was in the military. The person that they met, that was their first time meet the black person in person.
In the military.
In the military. When they went to the military, they stayed so far away from regular society. Okay.
Wow.
So now I say that to say the interesting thing is that you had a lot of white people in the country. They didn't own slaves. Mm-hmm. That was the elite. That was the
elite class.
That was the elite class. Those
Okay.
were the planters. Those were the ones that actually was making the money. They would be your 3% nowadays. You know what I'm saying? Those was the ones. That was a small group
Right.
that was owning a lot of stuff.
Everybody didn't have slaves.
And everybody didn't even see slaves in real life. So back then, the entertainment, in order to represent black people in these movies, they used to have these, what do they call them, minstrels? Minstrels?
Vaudeville actors and minstrel shows.
Minstrel shows.
Okay.
Where you would have white actors that would paint, they would blackface.
The blackface.
The blackface dudes.
Uh-huh.
Jim Crow was the most famous of all of the minstrel blackface actors. And that was white people's only experience. He was the most popular black person that they knew.
Wow.
That was a name that they can say that they can substitute for black people, and all of the white people knew who they was talking about. Oh, we talking about black people. So Jim Crow took the place. They said, okay, all right. And this dude wasn't even in politics. He was in entertainment. But it was like, okay, Jim Crow, these are the Jim Crow laws. These are the laws for black people. Jim Crow laws. So and we still dealing with some of that today.
Yeah,
what I'm saying?
we are.
It don't stop. So
let me ask you. So we tying this in. We got the whole Juneteenth. We done came across and we done diligently did a study of the history and everything. Okay. You got a lot of festivals. You got parades. You got traditions of red food and red drinks.
Right.
How should we now, knowing what we know, and the ups and the downs of slavery, the end of slavery,
right.
abolishments, how should we look at the whole celebration of Juneteenth going forward?
I'll tell you, because I never really celebrated it before. I'll tell you what I look to do is celebrate the holiday, but not out of the posture of somebody who I'm just sitting over here and I'm so glad that y'all saved me. My thing is celebrate the holiday, but with your chin up, your shoulders back, proud of the work that we put in. You know, like they say, a person who's not willing to live and die and fight for his own, if he's not willing to finance his own freedom, and then he don't deserve it. Right. Well, this ain't something that y'all did for us. This is something that we put the work in and we paid the price to get. Right. You know what I'm saying? And it's motivation to say, okay, let's do this celebration as a reminder so that we at least pick the ball up where they left it and start to do the work of carrying that thing forward.
Right, that's big. Because I think they said that the red food and red drinks is symbolic to the bloodshed that
Yeah.
Blood, sweat, and tears, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Red velvet cake, strawberry pop.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole nine.
Yeah.
You know, and we celebrating it today. You don't see no red velvet cake nowhere.
Yeah,
Ain't no, you know, so we don't even really know.
Yeah.
But the more we get into it, I think hopefully something like this, you know, we can only an hour, we can only do so much,
Right.
but hopefully it gives people something to, you know, give them motivation to say, okay, let me look a little bit more into this, learn a little bit more of it, and go from there.
That's big.
All right. So I think that's it, man. That's all we can
man.
do at this point. You know what I'm saying? Good little show.
We covered a lot, man.
Covered a
We
lot in a
covered
little
lot.
bit of time. So, done deal, man. Stick a
Done
fork
deal.
in it. And we'll check y'all out at a later time. We'll see you next time on the spot.
Peace.